What were the Fyrds? Fyrds were militias in Anglo-Saxon England, so think about the time period of roughly the 5th century to about 1066 AD. England was broken up into a bunch of different kingdoms at this point, and each of those kingdoms were broken down into different shires, and each of those shires, or at least many of them, would have Fyrds or local militias. The militias would have consisted of churls or freedmen. These freedmen would be called up for service periodically, particularly when there was large-scale invasion or raiding. In the early Anglo-Saxon period before the Vikings, the Fyrds wouldn't have been mustered all that often. Why? Well, first of all, most of the warfare would have been small-scale raiding, and second, when there were large battles between the different kingdoms, typically they were fought in a heroic style, and it would have been small-scale armies that would have been fighting professionally. And they'd even have, basically almost like picking a fight in high school or something. They would meet at a certain place at a certain time, and it almost was kind of choreographed the way that the warfare would have been in the early Anglo-Saxon period. When the Vikings started coming, they came in greater numbers, and those small professional armies that those English kingdoms had were wiped out pretty quickly. So the Anglo-Saxons needed something to counter the Vikings, so they started using more and more frequently the Fyrd. Initially, the Fyrds weren't all that successful against the Vikings because they were farmers that literally brought their own equipment to battle. And they were only there for the summer season. They had to be at home for spring and for the fall harvest season. King Alfred the Great made some major changes to the Fyrds, though, by the latter half of the 9th century, and this made the Fyrds significantly more effective against the Vikings. First of all, he had the Fyrds fight on a rotation, so certain people would be called up at certain times, others would be called at other times, and this ensured that Alfred had an army in the field anytime that he needed it. He also created a series of fortified structures called boroughs around towns, and this helped keep the Fyrds more defensive and ensured they had some protection against the Viking raiders. Essentially, what would happen is a small army could hold these forts while a larger army could come relieve them when they were under siege. The Fyrds would have been Anglo-Saxons' preeminent method for countering the Vikings until the arrival of King Canute in the 11th century. Canute would reform the taxation system in England, and thereby he was able to maintain more of a professional army.